Before we begin, I want to inform you that this video is the second part of a two-part series on Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. While it is not necessary to watch the first part, I recommend watching it in order to fully appreciate the contents of this video. There's a link in the description box. In any medium of art, there are standard setters, touchstones from which other creators draw inspiration. For anybody that experiences masterpieces like The Godfather or Dark Side of the Moon or Half-Life for the first time, they see how these works more or less permitted the content which came after. While it must have been difficult for the creators to perfect these archetypal works, what is arguably more difficult is for their successors to borrow elements from these works and incorporate them into their own, without accusations of plagiarism. In the case of the aforementioned Hellblade, the balancing act between inspiration and originality might have been perfected. In my mind, I cannot help but think that the Silent Hill franchise somehow influenced this game's conception. However, there is enough reasonable doubt in play here. The developers over at Ninja Theory could outright say that Silent Hill had little to no effect on the creation of Hellblade, and I would believe them. Today, I ask you to engage in my little experiment. Help me figure out if the connections I draw between Hellblade and Silent Hill are at least reasonable, even if they are ultimately incorrect. Even if there are no direct connections in terms of story or characters, they both seem to take advantage of the same psychological concepts, which is probably why both games are so effective with their takes on psychological horror. The similarities I will present range from visual to conceptual, small and large. To begin with, I'll start with the central concept of both games. In regards to the horrors inherent to both Silent Hill and Hellblade, it is confirmed that the monsters, and to some extent the environment, are projections of one's mind. In Hellblade, the gods and monsters Senua must fight are the products of her psychosis, her inner world bleeding into her outer world. In Silent Hill, the town presents various characters with manifestations of their unconscious minds. The monsters in both games take on twisted and demonic demeanors for a couple of reasons. The Northmen in Hellblade killed Senua's lover Dillion, but she never saw the Northmen when they did it. Therefore, she had no way of accurately conceptualizing what they looked like. Her unconscious mind compensated for this fact by portraying them in the worst possible way, symbolizing the infinite pain and horror the Northmen caused her. In contrast, James from Silent Hill 2 is trying to remember what happened to his wife. His unconscious mind is trying to help him piece this memory back together, and can only do so by personifying elements of his memory. For instance, the bubblehead nurses represent James smothering his wife with a pillow. Just like with the monsters in Hellblade, the monsters in Silent Hill take on the worst possible form in order to symbolize James's inner pain and horror. As for the environments, one visual cue I noticed between both games was the tendency for the environments to shift in their composition. In Silent Hill 3, we see the various structures surrounding Heather Mason actively change in composition, from something that looks normal to something that looks rusted, with blood shifting across various surfaces. In Hellblade, we see the fabric of reality fall apart and become pieced together again through Senua's efforts. The walls and floors shift as well, but instead of blood, it's darkness. As for why the environment shifts in this way, I believe Hellblade and Silent Hill share the same basic concept. 2 years ago, I did a video on Silent Hill titled The Multiple Dimension Theory. In that video, I explained how reality would construct and deconstruct depending on one's state of mind. The town's cycling between the fog world and the other world in Silent Hill was akin to slipping into consciousness and unconsciousness. Due to the fact that Silent Hill's horrors are projections of one's state of mind, it would make sense that the town would cycle between a conscious state where everything is much more distinguished and ordered, and an unconscious state where everything is chaotic and less clear. The same theory applies to Hellblade. Senua is projecting her own internal descent into unconsciousness onto the world around her. This takes the form of her journey into Helheim. Depending on where she is in her journey, the internal world she is projecting can become shrouded in darkness, shattered like pieces of glass, or transmutate into hell itself. itself. As I stated in my previous video on Hellblade, reality only exists insofar as we are able to create a psychic image of it. If we can't distinguish between objective reality and the illusions our mind creates for us, then we are doomed to a state of chaos. Our mind is pulled apart by these dual realities, so appropriately visualized by the twitching heads in both games. Now that we have established how both games project one's mental contents, let us be more specific about what those contents are. Though the unconscious may be symbolized by a dark, mysterious nothingness, psychoanalytic theory has discovered various patterns in the unconscious, which are universal to all humans. There are two patterns in particular that I wish to discuss, both of which have been presented in two of my previous videos on Silent Hill. The concepts I refer to are that of the Jungian animus and anima, and the Freudian id. For the sake of time and clarity, I will simplify both concepts and their application to Silent Hill. According to the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, the anima is the personification of all feminine psychological tendencies in a man's psyche. In other words, the anima is the feminine side of a man. The anima guides the way a man relates to women and the world around him. If you are male, you are more likely to repress your feminine side, as it is difficult to reconcile with your pre-existing masculine side. If, however, a man is able to bring these unconscious feminine traits into conscious territory and integrate them into his everyday life, he might reach a higher state of being, or a feeling of wholesomeness. In regards to Silent Hill 2, I proposed that the character of Maria was a projection of James's inner anima, to which most people seem to agree. In respect to Hellblade, I theorized that Senua is experiencing a similar problem, except the gendered language is flipped accordingly. Where James is possessed by the anima, Senua is possessed by the animus, the masculine psychological tendencies inside of a woman. Allow me to cite the evidence to support my thesis. Through the early years of one's life, one's mother and father often influence one's psychological makeup. According to Jung, the mother tends to shape, but not always, the inner anima of a man, and the father tends to shape, but not always, the inner animus of a woman. In Hellblade, Senua's animus takes the form of her father, Zinbel. The reason why Senua's animus takes on such a negative form is because her relationship with her father was strained, to say the least. One thing I neglected to mention in my previous videos are the consequences of possession by the anima or animus. Depending on how one's inner animus is shaped, the results can be positive or negative. For example, if a woman integrates her animus successfully, she will be more assertive. If she doesn't integrate it successfully, she will become confrontational for the sake of being confrontational. When one is animus possessed, the woman tends to project her inner animus onto other men. If she comes across a man who has traits or opinions she does not like, she will become extremely combative. In respect to Senua, the fact that her mother died at a young age, along with being continuously surrounded by men, didn't allow her to develop a positive feminine identity, or any feminine identity at all. This allowed for her inner masculine traits to control her entire personality. This has its positive effects. For example, she is a fiercer warrior than any man she encounters. However, being animus possessed has left Senua in a state of persistent mental and physical combat. While she projects her animus into the outer world and constantly argues with it, this tension is mirrored within. There are various other consequences to being animus possessed, many of which also apply to Senua. Here's an article which lists some of the symptoms. The animus in this woman has one goal, and that is to pull her away from life and cut her off from it. Zinbel constantly pulled Senua away from life and forced her into solitude. The animus in the form of Zinbel wishes to exacerbate Senua's mental illness, in turn making her life a constant fight for survival. The animus is critical and harsh, and he constantly whispers to this woman that she is a failure, that she can't amount to anything, and that it is too late now anyway. Zinbel, along with the animus in the form of Zinbel, persistently chastised Senua for being weak and pathetic. My final piece of evidence comes from the name Zinbel. Based on my research, Zinbel is a real name. Derived from Welsh, Sin means chief, and Bel means war. If the animus promotes feelings of argumentation and aggressiveness inside a woman, and Senua's animus is shaped by her father, then of course the developers gave Senua's father a name which means warrior chief. It is because because the warrior chief instilled the warrior in Senua, for better or for worse. To conclude this video, I will now address how the Freudian id may have influenced both Silent Hill and Hellblade. In my video titled Who Pyramid Head Is, I deduced that the character of Pyramid Head was the personification of James's inner id. For those who are unfamiliar with what the Freudian id is, it is the hedonistic part of the human psyche. The id contains all the aspects about ourselves that we wish to repress for the sake of being, or at least appearing, civilized. These aspects can include violence, sexual gratification, gluttony, etc. Pyramid Head embodies these negative traits, and more. In respect to Hellblade, I could not help but think that Surt was heavily inspired by Pyramid Head. Just look at their models. Both carry an oversized blade, both are drenched in blood, both have their head concealed, and depending on which version of Pyramid Head you're looking at, they both have their chests exposed and some form of apron. I cannot help but think that Senua's projection of Surt is the personification of her own id. Apparently, I am not alone in my assumptions either. Now let me reiterate what I said at the beginning of this video. The connections I am trying to draw between Hellblade and Silent Hill are circumspect. If the developers over at Ninja Theory saw this video, I would believe them if they said I am reading too much into it. To be honest, I would much rather them tell me that there is no connection between their game and Silent Hill, because that would be much more fascinating. Allow me to explain why. As I stated in my previous video on Hellblade, the gods of Norse mythology, as well as several other religions, can be linked to our unconscious processes, the psychic mechanisms that control us. This is why the Greeks had gods of war, of love, of death, because we are slaves to these emotions. These mechanisms are universal to all human beings, which is why gods of war, love, and death appear cross-culturally. Even if Ninja Theory didn't consciously make any connection between Hellblade and Silent Hill, maybe the creation of certain characters like certain Pyramid Head or Zimbel and Maria all extend from the same unconscious processes. Maybe this is why the stories of both games are so effective with their horror, because on an unconscious level, we see our own id, our own anima or animus, our own inner darkness in these monsters. Even though we can turn off the TV or close the book on them at any time, they will forever inhabit our unconscious minds and forever control the way we function.